All right, welcome everyone. My name is Danielle. I am a career educator at the University of British Columbia. I'm offering today's session on applying to grad school as part of the preparation for the West Coast Virtual Fair. So in just a second, I will talk a little bit more about the fair and do some acknowledgements, but I will be facilitating today's session for you. It's always very nice for me to work with folks from different institutions as well. If you do have any questions as you progress through the session, you're welcome to type them in the chat. That's the easiest way to do it. I will read them off the chat. I'm not going to read people's names, just so it stays a bit more anonymous. And if you are watching this from the future in one of our recordings, you should be able to get those questions as well. For folks who do have your cameras on, you're welcome to keep them on if you would like, but just know that that may show up in the recording. So before we get started with today's session, I would like to acknowledge the lands where the three institutions involved in this partnership are located. So I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kaikat, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, Tuasin, Esquimalt, and Songhees peoples, on whose unceded traditional and ancestral territories our three universities reside. And I would invite all of you, wherever you are located, to continue the process of living and learning in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. As I mentioned, I know there is a few folks continuing to come on in, so that's totally okay. The West Coast Virtual Fair is very grateful for some of the sponsorship that we've received. So if any of these companies or organizations are of interest to you, I would invite you to consider checking them out. And there are some additional upcoming preparation sessions that will be happening later this week. So tomorrow there is an employer panel on networking. I know that's a popular topic, especially with the fair coming up. And then a panel discussion, I was really happy to see this, well-being and job search. So I would encourage you to register and attend any of those. If you aren't able to make them, I know it is a busy time of year, you're also welcome to watch the recording of those sessions. And that is a good reminder for me. Today's session is being recorded. If you need to leave or step away, you'll be able to go back and access the recording. It may take a day or two before that recording is available, but you will be able to access it. You should also have the option as we progress to access captions. So if you would like those, please feel free to turn them on and use them during the session. The platform for the West Coast Virtual Fair is going to open on October 26th. So when the platform opens, you can create your profile, you can look at the booths for the different schools, companies, and organizations who will be represented. Feel free to start booking those sessions with the people you would like to talk to. And then all of the sessions, so all of the opportunities to actually interact with a school or an employer will happen on November 2nd and November 3rd. So just know that you'll be able to get into the platform later this week. I believe that for many of you, your institution may be offering a how to prepare session that will cover the logistics. If you are a UBC student, there will be a UBC session on October 31st. I believe that UVIC and SFU are also offering them. So feel free to check and connect with your institution if you would like to. Just some more information about receiving access to the platform, but you'll also get that as long as you're registered for the fair. And without further ado, I think most people are into the session, so I'm going to start talking about the applying to graduate school piece. So many of you may be thinking about attending the West Coast Virtual Fair in order to network with and talk to some of the educational programs who will be represented there. At the end of this presentation, I'll touch a bit on how to go about that. But most of today's presentation is going to focus on approaching applications to grad school. And for me, that means understanding a bit about different grad programs. As we progress, if you have questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat. I'm happy to address them as we come to them. So when I think about different graduate programs you might pursue after the completion of a bachelor's or initial degree, I tend to think about three main categories of program. research, professional, or course-based masters, and then regulated professional programs. So for the next few minutes, I'll just touch briefly on each of those three types of programs, some of the key differences, and some of the things to keep in mind if you are applying to one. So first up, I will talk about research programs. Some examples would be something like a master's in chemistry, a master's in history. Virtually all PhD programs are going to be a research-based graduate program. One clue in my mind that a program might be a research program is that it may sound like an academic discipline that you could have majored in as an undergrad. So if you are currently studying chemistry as an undergrad, you probably have the option to continue and pursue a master's in that discipline. For a research-focused graduate program, the focus of these programs is generating new knowledge in an academic discipline. So it's kind of what the definition of research is. You're going to look at a question or a problem or an area that has not previously been explored. Just kind of exciting when you think about it. What that means will look very different depending on your academic discipline, but I think that's a really useful kind of framing. You're going to be generating new knowledge within the academic field of your choice. It might involve a thesis, although it might not. Something that's useful to keep in mind is thinking about whether programs do involve a thesis, whether that's something you're interested in or not. But I think for a research program, there's a good chance that that will be a possibility. A research-based program is also likely to involve working with a supervisor. A supervisor is just a professor who's going to kind of oversee your project, give you advice, kind of be your mentor and your boss in graduate school. So likely if you're in a research program, you will have one of those. We'll talk more about finding supervisors and how that process works a little bit later on. And in general, if you're thinking about applying to a research program, some of the things they're likely going to be looking for. So the prerequisite is probably going to be an undergraduate program in the same or a similar academic discipline. There may certainly be some flexibility there, but likely if someone is applying to do their master's in history, they likely have an undergraduate degree in history or something pretty similar to that. These programs also tend to value previous research experience if that's available to you. So that won't always be available to you, and it looks a little bit different in different academic disciplines. But one very common way this might play out is if someone, say, is applying to like a master's degree to do research in biochemistry, maybe they are volunteering in a professor's lab related to biochemistry or psychology or different disciplines. So how that plays out will look a little bit different, but often these are the programs where previous research experience is helpful or can be valuable. Professional or course-based master's programs are also master's programs. They tend to be a little bit different in their focus and structure. And some examples of the programs that I tend to think about when I think about this category would be like an MBA, a Master of Food Science, Master of Data Science, Master of Public Policy. You might notice, right, even just by the titles of these programs, they sound a little bit different. And I think that that's a clue to what these programs are often set up to do. I would say that loosely, their focus is learning additional skills and knowledge that is related both to an academic discipline and also a potential field of work. So you are studying and looking at the academic discipline, but you're also getting some pretty solid preparation to likely work in a related field. These programs can vary a lot in their structure and what's involved, but I think typically they may have options such as a capstone project or a practicum, co-op, other experiential opportunities are a bit more common. And that would be a really good thing to think about if you're thinking about these type of master's programs, what aspects of a program or structure are important to you. They are certainly good to value a related academic experience. And I think there's a reasonable chance they're also going to be interested in previous work or volunteering experience that is related. That might be quite broad, right? It doesn't have to be in exactly the same area as the degree, but something somewhat relevant. And often, if you look at the program requirements or prerequisites, it's going to be an undergraduate program in a related field and maybe some relevant experience. Relevant experience is going to depend on program. Like I think about MBA programs is a really good example where they may actually have a minimum requirement of something like 2 years of experience, or, they may actually really want to see a significant amount of work experience. Other programs will be perhaps more flexible, but I think that relevant experience is going to be helpful. And then the third category of graduate program is in some ways, I think, maybe the most familiar. So I would describe these, and this is just my terminology, but like regulated professional programs. So law school, med school, physiotherapy, counseling, teachers college, etc. These are programs where you have to complete the program in order to have the designation to legally work within that profession. As you can see, probably by looking at this list of examples, these are regulated professions for a reason. There is a good requirement that the public wants to know that someone working in this field and using this title has completed a specific type and amount of education. So in fact, if you're enrolled in one of these programs, what you're actually doing is preparing to meet those credential and regulatory requirements so that you can say, yes, I am licensed and certified as a dentist. You can safely come and have me practice. These programs are absolutely going to value academic experience, and I think also work and volunteering experience. If you are looking at something in the health-related fields, they may want to see related volunteering, or something in counseling or social work may want to see peer helping or counseling-related experience. And again, the prerequisite is probably going to be an undergraduate program in a related field. I will say, because of the nature of these programs, there's often multiple different degrees that would make you eligible. If we take law school as an example, someone can apply to law school with an undergraduate degree in poli-sci or philosophy or economics or international relations. There's really a wide range of undergraduate disciplines that might allow you to apply. As I mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll also pause throughout and leave some time at the end. But I hope that starts to give you a bit of an overview of some of the differences between different types of grad programs. And you may want to be thinking about, of the programs you're interested in, where would you situate them and what category do they fall in? I also want to talk a little bit about exploring options. It is very common to not feel completely sure what graduate program you want to apply to, or maybe if you want to go to grad school at all, or when you want to go to grad school. So if those questions are coming up for you, I really encourage you to explore those options. Some of the ways that I think you can do that, if you know that you hope to work in a specific field, if there is a job title or a career path that you aspire to, I would recommend researching the educational background of people working in that field, or maybe even talking to them. Looking ahead to tomorrow's panel on networking will probably be some great strategies for how you might do that. It's really helpful to understand, is a graduate degree necessary to do the kind of work I hope to do? The answer might be yes, absolutely. You need that graduate degree. Okay, that's good information to have. The answer might be, it's helpful. It's an asset. A lot of people have it, but it's not a requirement. Okay, also good information. Or the answer might absolutely be that it's optional, that some people pursue graduate studies, but lots of people start working and gain experience. So it's just really, I think, good to have that insight and that perspective. If you are talking to people in a given field, I would also be asking questions about what skills or knowledge are most helpful for you to learn in graduate school. Are there specific things that they would really recommend your graduate program cover? Programs are not necessarily standardized across institutions, depending on what they cover. They will be for those sort of regulatory fields, but if you're doing a Master's of Public Policy at 2 different universities, you might take different courses, you might learn different things. Which of those programs is actually going to be the best match for what you're hoping to do? I would also invite you to think about what is most important to you. So do you know that you really want to write a thesis or don't want to write a thesis? Do you really want to absolutely make sure you have a co-op option as part of your master's, or it's not so important to you? Do you want the chance to study abroad or work with an expert in a certain field? As you start to understand what your goals are from your graduate school experience, I think you'll better know which programs would be a good fit or would be a good match for you. And then I think this last one is also really helpful to consider. What is the best timeline for you? I know sometimes people are quite keen to finish their undergraduate studies and go directly into graduate school. That's fine. If that works for you, by all means, that can be a great timeline. It is also totally okay in most cases to take some time, gain some work experience, build some work experience, and then come back to graduate school. If that's something you're thinking about doing, I would recommend talking with maybe a career advisor at your institution, people working in the field that you hope to go into, maybe some professors in the academic discipline. But I think in a lot of cases, there can be some real advantages to potentially continuing your graduate studies at a later date. And absolutely, people come back to do masters and other degrees well after they have wrapped up their bachelor's. Some just general considerations for choosing a graduate program, particularly as you start to research what schools offer the program that you're interested in. So I just mentioned this: structure, program, and opportunities. How long is the program? What will you get to do? Is it aligned with the skills that you want to learn? If you are applying to a research program where you would be working with a specific professor as your supervisor, is there someone in the field that you're interested in? Do they have the expertise to supervise you? If you really want to do a research project on a specific topic, do they have the infrastructure and the individual for you to do it there? Funding is also worth thinking about. This will depend on the degree that you're applying to and can also vary from school to school. But is there funding? What is that funding offer going to look at? That is a really valid thing to be thinking about as you're considering different schools and potentially which offers you would accept. If you are able to, and this doesn't have to be right before you apply, but I think more like before you accept an offer, are you able to talk to any students or alumni from the graduate program that you're interested in? They can give you really good insight into what sort of experience they had within the program, what they took away, what their career outcomes have been. At the fair next week, some people at the tables may be alumni from the program, so great question to ask. But I would absolutely be thinking about, can I actually talk to some people who are or have studied in this program before I commit to taking that on? Location is really, really valid to think about. Are you looking for an opportunity to go somewhere else, a different city or a different country? Or on the flip side, do you want to be somewhere where you know that you have a specific network where there's supports in mind? Of course, depending on what you're going to study, that may also determine the location. If you are going to study oceanography, there's probably some schools where that makes more sense than others. I see a question in the chat, and I'll come to it in just a second. The final point I wanted to just touch on here is thinking a little bit about reputation of program and school. And, that is absolutely worth looking at. At the same time, I think there's often individual factors that determine whether a program and a school are the right fit for you. So I think of reputation as one factor among many. You want to consider it within your decision, but also think about, is this school really the right fit for me? Yes, so there's a question, would you be able to go into detail about funding? Is this something that we apply for? Is it offered to individuals? Okay, so the short version, and I'm going to try to simplify this, depends a lot on the program. So in my experience, professional programs, and I'm going to just back up to that slide, professional programs funding might be more limited. That's not to say there isn't any, but I think about it more like undergraduate model. There may be scholarships or awards available. You may have the option to apply for those when you apply. You may have the option to apply for those once you're studying. If you are looking at the kind of research-based programs, there often are more opportunities for funding. And I would say it's actually quite common if you're doing this type of master's or PhD degree that you actually get kind of a funding package or funding offer when you apply. So kind of like a job offer, here's the money you will get to study in this program. That package may be combined of money that is a grant or an award. It may also include work opportunities like research assistantships or teaching assistantships. So you are working and then you get paid for that, and that's considered part of your funding package. So how you go about getting funding is going to depend on the type of program. It may be that you're automatically considered for some. It is also worth looking at, are there additional sources of funding that I can apply to? Typically, the best people to talk about that with would be either coordinators or folks working at the program that you apply to. If the program has like an info session or an info night, great question. They may have links on their website. If you're going to the fair next week, 100% would ask about funding opportunities. And then I would also talk to potential professors in the field, particularly for like a research-based program. I would talk to a professor in that department. Is there funding you should be looking for? So that's sort of a short, high-level answer, but I hope that touches on some of those key points. I'm going to take a few more questions. There's a question about ways to choose a supervisor. I have a slide on that in a few minutes. So if that doesn't answer your question, we'll come back to it. Is there a funding available for psychology counseling programs if you're doing a thesis? There might be, but that's going to be specific to the program. And one thing you will notice for graduate programs in general, it can vary a lot from program to program. So I think your source for any specific questions is going to be that program's website and then the coordinator or the contact for that program, because it may even vary from school to school. Yes, yep, and we'll talk about this when we come to supervisors, but there's a question. If you want to apply to multiple programs at different institutions, should you approach multiple potential supervisors? Yes, if you're applying to 3 different universities, you would need to talk with prospective supervisors at each of them. Now, I think that's kind of something to think about, but yes, you would need to be in touch with potential supervisors at the different institutions. Yeah, do all programs open for application around a certain time? So often the program or the application will kind of go live at a certain date. I find it's typically kind of early to mid-fall. So right where we are now, I think a lot of applications are currently live and maybe just coming up to being live. If for some reason something isn't yet, if they don't have a date listed, I might give it another couple weeks and then maybe see if you can email someone at the program just to see if they have a date for you. But for most programs, the application cycle you're going to see is often the information and the kind of application, as I said, going live sometime September, October, and then often application deadlines December, January, February, all the way through the winter and into the spring. That can absolutely vary, so always check your specific program. But if for some reason you weren't seeing it live yet, you could just drop them an email and see what they're at. Do you have to apply for external funding opportunities to fund your research? You might have to. So I'm going to put 3 acronyms in the chat. And these are the 3 federal funding agencies in Canada. So if you are hoping to study in Canada, they're good things to be aware of for research programs. NSERC deals with sciences, CIHR deals with health research, and SSHRC deals with social sciences and humanities. I'm not able to in this session do a deep dive on what they offer, but it would be a good place for you to get started, to familiarize yourself with, to reach out to the department or professor in your field. And often for research programs and external funding, that might be a pathway towards that. Funding programs for international students. It is often a bit of a combination. Often it would actually be your home country that would have funding opportunity that you can take abroad. So I would be in touch with or do some research into any sort of funding opportunities that are offered by your home country. You can do some research there. You could also talk potentially to your career center at your institution or some professors in your department and see if they have recommendations. Few more questions here. How many graduate programs or institutions should you apply to? So as many as makes sense for you. The most typical range for most people seems to be between 3 and 5. So that's not to say you have to apply to that many. If you only have 1 or 2, that makes sense for you. I would just apply to those 1 or 2. It's important to keep in mind that it does cost money for each application, and it also costs time. So I think you want to be mindful of not over applying. At the same time, if you're like, there's 4 programs that I would genuinely be interested in and excited about, it's totally fine to go ahead and apply to all 4. Most people, I think, seem to fall in the 3, 4, or 5 range. If you're applying to many more than that, I think you just want to be aware that that is time and money for each successive application that you're putting out there. Question, if Canadian students go abroad for grad school, would it be difficult to find a job with their degree when they come back? I think it depends on the degree, and I think it depends on the type of job. To go back to the idea of talking to people in your field about kind of expectations and how to approach thinking about grad school, that would be a great question. Someone in the chat is saying, very. Thank you for that insight. I appreciate that. It absolutely can be. I think to that point about location, if you know, and not even across countries, but even different cities, if you know that you want to work in a particular area eventually, it is probably somewhat beneficial to do your graduate studies there, because that may be where there's a local network. If you're doing something like practicums or co-op, it might be helpful. So I mean, people move, you certainly can, but I think there may be challenges if you study other places. And certainly if you're looking at anything regulated, I think you would really want to double check, will that credential even carry over? Because say someone goes and gets a law degree in Ireland, will they be able to practice law when they come back to Canada, or counseling or whatever it is? So definitely some things that are worth looking into. Are co-op programs national or international? If they are, does it make more sense to do the co-op in the city where I'm studying, or would you recommend another city to explore a variety of locations? So depends on the co-op program. Some absolutely will offer international options. Some may only have options available in Canada. I think it depends on, again, where you hope to work. And I would think also a little bit about the reputation and visibility in the employer. If it's the opportunity to do a co-op in Singapore or Germany or wherever, and it's quite a well-known employer, I wouldn't worry so much about that impacting, your ability to get hired afterwards. I think probably, if anything, that will be seen as a strength. On the other hand, I think if you work with a more local employer, or maybe a smaller employer, sometimes there's a better chance that that could turn into a job offer post-graduation. So I would, as you go through the co-op process, as you do interviews, choose the place that you're most excited about, that makes the most sense with the work that you want to do. There's probably pros and cons both ways. One last question, then I'm going to pick up the presentation again. If I'm only sure about one school, but skeptical about others due to relocation, what's the best way? I'm not sure whether you mean, should I even apply to the others, or how do I make my decision? As far as should I even apply to the others? I think you want to weigh the cost in terms of application fee and time, and the odds that you would actually go. If you think, I need a few more months to think about it, but I might be willing to accept the offer, then it may be helpful to apply now and then know that you have that possibility down the road. If you're there's no chance I'm going to go to the school, then there's probably no point in applying. If your question was how do I decide? I think that's where talking to professors in that department, talking to students, talking to alumni, and if possible? I don't know how far away relocation is, but is it possible to spend a weekend or a few days there? I think that would give you certainly a taste of campus, of, the city or the town where it's located. So those would be my thoughts. Thanks, folks, for those questions. I just want to touch a little bit on the application materials, which I'm sure will bring up some more questions, and then we'll go from there. So generally speaking, lots of variation depending on the program that you're applying to, but some of the things that will likely be involved when you're applying. Look over those program requirements. We mentioned, the timeline when the application will open. If there are standardized tests, GRE, LSAT, GMAT, those kind of things, make sure that you have the timeline right to complete it, get your results in good time. Make sure you understand when the deadline for the program is, because the deadline is usually quite strict. I will talk about reaching out to potential supervisors in just a minute, but if that's something you need to do, something to start doing. We talked a bit about funding and scholarship applications. So if that is something you need to do, something to start thinking about. References. You will almost certainly need references as part of your application. So good to start thinking about who is going to write those reference letters and letting those folks know early. I'll talk in more detail about that in just a minute or two. And then starting to prepare your application documents. So typically CV or resume, a statement of intent or statement of purpose, possibly some other documents, including a transcript as well. There can be quite a lot of documents to put together, and you definitely want to give yourself some time to edit them, proofread them, potentially get feedback on them. So I would say you want to be thinking about this well ahead of time and not trying to write the documents up at the last minute. Thank you in the chat there. So touch on the supervisor piece. First thing you need to figure out is, do you need a supervisor? Not all graduate programs require you to have one, depending on the type of program, structure program. If you don't need a supervisor, great, that is one less step to think about. If you do, if you are going to have a supervisor who you will work with, one thing that's really good to figure out, and usually the program website will tell you this, or you can ask, is do you need to secure that supervisor when you apply, or do you apply, get in, start the program, and then you pick your supervisor once you're in the program? So those are two different kind of pathways. It will depend just on your academic discipline. If they're like, just apply and we'll figure out your supervisor once you're here, I think you want to think about who your supervisor might be so that you're reflecting on that, but slightly different pathways depending on the approach. If you do need to find a supervisor as part of your application, this is something to start thinking about early. Typically, this is going to involve emailing professors to ask if they are currently accepting students, mentioning why you're reaching out to them, what do you know about their research, why are you interested in working with them, and why is there a match between what you want to do and what they do. Short email, so I think concise and well written is helpful. You may want to attach a CV or a resume so they can get a sense of your background, and it may take a while for them to get back to you. But if this is part of the process for you, I think it's a good thing to be thinking about earlier. I'm just going to turn to some questions in the chat. I think the next two questions, one of which is about resume and then CV, I'll talk about in just a second. So more to come on that. And yeah, there was a question earlier about reaching out to professors. So these are the basic guidelines I would keep in mind. Start early, write a concise email, and be very clear on, not a generic email, that show that you've maybe read some of their papers or you've looked at their research. Why is what you want to do similar to what they're currently doing? You can mention courses you've taken or things that are relevant as well. So there's a question about, do you put a statement of interest in the email to the professor? So I typically think that first email you want to keep simple, just so that they aren't having to read a lot of material. If they say, yes, sounds good. I would love to be your supervisor next year. And then you continue with the application. I might share with them the statement of interest at that time or ask if they're willing to give you feedback on it. But I probably wouldn't send them the statement of interest right away before they've even agreed to it. I think at the beginning, probably a CV or resume and just the request is a good way to go. They may also want to like meet with you or have a meeting to continue the discussion. So I think it's helpful to just kind of provide that information when they ask for it. They might certainly ask for it, but you don't need to kind of rush it. There's been a couple questions in the chat about the recording, and yes, the recording will be up on the website probably in a day or two, and you'll get the link to that. We'll talk about references in a minute there. Great. So a couple questions about resumes and CVs. The big one is often, what's the difference? So a CV is just a resume that is slightly more focused on research or academic experience. Where I would start to get an idea of how CVs are structured or set up, if you take a look at the kind of bio pages or the profiles for some professors in your discipline, probably many of them have copies of their CV online that you can look at. Current grad students, so master's or PhD students, may also have their CVs visible, or if you've talked with any of them, you could ask if they're willing to share theirs. A CV is like often a semi-public document, so I find people are often quite willing to show it to you. Now, important thing to keep in mind, if you're applying to a master's program, you're not going to have the same amount of stuff that a more senior researcher might have, and you may not even have some of the categories. I'm thinking about something like publications or teaching experience, but it can be really useful to look at these examples of CVs to get an idea of just how they're structured and what some of the sections are. And I know that there was a question earlier about, can I still make a CV if I don't have research or TA experience? Absolutely. I think what I would do in that case is just make sure you're maybe highlighting projects or courses that are relevant, maybe even just moving the sections around. And if at this stage, which would be really normal, you don't have those experiences, your CV may basically be the same as your resume. The difference only really starts to happen as people kind of do more research-related materials. So I think it may be the case that your resume and your CV are essentially the same, is just kind of focusing a bit more on any projects, coursework, research, or academic experience if you have it. A CV should be as long as it needs to be. I think for a lot of folks applying to like a master's program, it's probably going to be about 2 pages, maybe 2.5. If you have had a lot of experience for whatever reason, it can be longer. I would just say pay attention to any application requirements. If they do say we want a 2-page CV, I would make sure it's only 2 pages. But if they don't give you a page requirement, it's probably going to be kind of a 2 to 3 page. Question about, should a CV include the courses you took and your grades? I don't think it has to, especially for a grad school application, because you're going to submit your transcript. So they will have all that information on your transcript and visible. If in a CV, you want to mention a specific project, maybe you did like a self-directed study or an honors thesis or just like a cool project in one of your courses, you could use the CV as a space to like elaborate on that. But I think just listing the courses and your grades, that's what the transcript is for. So you don't need to use your CV for that. The other document that you are likely going to be asked to submit will be a statement. It might be called a statement of purpose, a statement of intent. There's maybe a personal statement. Make sure you follow whatever instructions the program gives you, because they can give you different instructions depending. Be really mindful of word count here. If they say they want 750 words or 500 words or however many, you really want to make sure that you are within that word count. Answer any specific questions that they are asking. Otherwise, some good things to cover in the statement would be, why do you want to do a graduate school program? Why are you choosing this institution or this school? What are you bringing as far as previous experience or previous knowledge? This would be a good place to talk about any related experience you want to highlight. So yeah, they will probably give you some prompts and some questions to respond to, but generally you just want to make sure you're following the instructions and staying within the word count. If you are applying to multiple schools, because it seems like there were some questions about that in the chat, you want to customize your personal statement for each school. You don't need to start over. Some of the content will absolutely stay the same, but you certainly don't want to mention a professor who doesn't work at that school in the wrong statement, right? So similar to a cover letter for a job, customize it so it makes sense for the program that you're applying to and the school that you're applying to. But if you're applying to multiple programs, you can absolutely reuse some of that content. Depending on the program, they might ask for more documents. They could ask for a writing sample or a portfolio or, other things. So just when you look over those requirements, pay attention to what they're asking for and start thinking about that well in advance so that you have time to look at those pieces. References we'll talk about in just a second, and question about some of the programs require a one-page resume. Yeah, I would think this would look pretty much the same as if you were applying to a job. Now, especially if it's one page, right? If it's one page, you're really going to have to be quite selective about what you're including, and you're not going to be able to talk about everything. So I would choose the things that you feel most proud of, that you think are the best match to that program, and also be concise in what you're describing about them. Because if it's only one page, you just don't have a lot of space. But yeah, functionally, it might look quite similar to if you're applying for a job. I would just think about the job in that field, right? So the same way you would tailor a resume, make sure that this document makes sense in the context of the program that you're applying to. If you're applying to an education program, you probably want to relate to focus on things related to teaching, working with kids, etc. If you're applying to a policy program, you're going to make your choices based on what's relevant to that. There's a question about, would you submit either a resume or a CV or both? You only need to submit one. Follow whatever the program website tells you. If they say they want a CV, I think you just want a document that's a little bit more academic or research focused. If they say they want a resume, basically similar to what you would submit for a job, just bearing in mind, as I said, a job similar to the program. And if they say you can submit either, choose the one that you feel most confident about. If you have a resume that you used when you applied to internships last summer and it got you lots of interviews, by all means, go ahead and use that. If they're giving you the choice of the documents, choose the one that you feel is going to show you in a better light and that you feel most confident with. And just as a thought here, depending on what institution you are at, likely your career services maybe has an option to review and give you feedback on these materials. So they're a good office to reach out to. Do they provide feedback on these materials? You could also next week at the fair, if there are schools that you're planning to apply to, fair question to ask: do they prefer a resume or a CV? Do they have any specifications about lengths? Do they prefer anything specific in those documents? An example of a generic CV format. Yeah, there isn't really a generic format because so I think the best thing to look at would be, they may also have some examples of CVs as well. All right. Question about reference letters. I know there's been a few here, so it seems like exactly what we're getting to. I'll just run through that and then speak to any questions that haven't been covered. So the program should tell you we want 3 references, 4 references letter, however many letters, just go with whatever they tell you. If they give you a range, if they say 2 or 3, it's up to you. You can choose, but just make sure you follow whatever requirements. They will probably likely also tell you, we want academic references, which usually means a professor, someone who has either taught you a course or who you've done research with, or a professional reference. Now, professional reference might be a boss from a job, a supervisor from a volunteer, or a leadership position, someone who you know in a non-academic capacity. Again, depending on the program, they may want a mix. They may want one academic, one professional. So you're going to have to follow whatever they tell you. Helpful to think about someone who knows you well enough that they can speak about your work, right? So this will look different in different contexts. If it's a professor, maybe it's someone who you've taken a couple classes with, they've graded your assignments, you've participated in those classes. That might be just fine on the academic side. If it's a supervisor from like a co-op or a work term or a summer job, that's probably fantastic as well. But just someone who could actually say, this is what it's like to work with this person, and this is what I've seen of them. In terms of asking them, I think the sooner you can ask, typically the better. If you do have application deadlines that are coming up, give them lots of notice so that you can give them time to write these letters. If, say, you were to ask someone in October and the application is due in January, totally okay to check in December or January and just remind them, because they may not write that letter until fairly close to the application deadline. But I think if you ask them and they say yes, you also want to trust them that they will do it. You definitely don't want to be emailing them very regularly, but it's okay to remind them once or twice, especially if there's a long time between when you first ask them and when the application is due. And this came up before, so absolutely, someone who's writing you a reference letter will likely say, yeah, I'm happy to write you a reference. Could I see a copy of your personal statement or your CV? This is actually good. It also gives them an opportunity to give you any feedback if they want to. So I would see that as a bonus. But just good to know, if you are starting to ask for reference letters, I would expect they might want to see those documents, which means you maybe want to be at the stage where you have drafts of those documents or are pretty close to having those drafts. In terms of asking, I know a lot of students feel some worry or some nervousness about asking these questions. I think it's just important to remember most people are happy to hear that someone wants to go to grad school and continue their studies. It is also a really normal part of those jobs. So I think most people don't mind writing letters, particularly if you're well organized and you ask them well in advance. I really recommend when you make that ask to someone, phrasing it as, can you write me a strong reference letter? And the reason I like to phrase the question that way is if they say, yes, I'm happy to do that, you can feel confident that they've not only agreed to write you a letter, but they've agreed to write you a strong or a positive letter. It also creates the natural opportunity that, like, if for some reason they don't feel like they know you well enough or they don't have enough information or whatever it is, they can decline, and then you know, and you can move on and ask someone else. So just a thought, but something you may want to consider utilizing as you ask for reference letters. And then I think being really organized, right? Especially if you're applying to multiple programs or multiple schools, having a clear list or like a table or a chart where you break down, these are the different schools, here's the link to apply, here's the deadline. Maybe here's my information about the statement I'm submitting. Particularly if you want someone to send a letter to 4 or 5 different schools for you, how can you make that as streamlined and easy for them as possible? There were some questions in the chat. Just going to go back up here. Yes, okay, so what is an appropriate number of reference letters? It's usually okay to ask a reference to write for you. I mean, I think, as I said, a lot of people are applying to 3 or 4 different programs or schools, so that's probably fine. Also, you know, they're not almost certainly writing a new letter for each application. They're updating and submitting the same letter. So double check with whoever's going to be your reference if they have preferences or if they have like a cap or a maximum. But generally speaking, I think just say, you know, I'm planning to apply to 4 programs. Is it okay for you to write the letter for those 4 programs for me? And they can tell you if not. If I'm going to ask a prof for a reference letter, should I ask one prof for one program or 2 programs in the same institution? Or is it normal to ask one prof for more than one institution? Yeah, I think this is what I just spoke to. So yes, say I was applying to a program at UVIC and UCalgary and McGill. I think it's really normal that that prof would write a letter and send it to each of those 3 schools. So you want to give them the clear information about how they do so. Where I would give it a bit more thought is if you're actually applying to different programs. So if I'm applying to a Master's of Anthropology at UVIC, UCalgary, and McGill, probably that prof can send the same letter to each of those 3 Masters of Anthropology programs. If I'm applying to like a Master's of Anthropology and a law school and a public health and a fine arts, I may actually need different professors or different people to write those letters, and those might be different letters. I hope that's sort of clear. This is also something career advisors at your institution can chat with you about, but that's what I would keep in mind. If it's essentially the same letter going different places, that's fine. If it's getting to be like entirely different programs, you may need new letters. Good question. What happens when you need a professor as a reference, but you've been out of undergrad for a number of years? Is it possible to use 2 work references? Yeah, so you may want to consider reaching out to the program that you're applying to, so the grad program, particularly if it is the case that you've been out of school for a number of years. There have definitely been cases where they have made an exception and they have said, okay, yeah, in that case, professional references are fine, but I would want to check with them first, not just send out the professional references and hope for the best. So if that's the case, especially if you've been out of school for a while, I would get in contact with the program, explain the situation, and see what they recommend. Is it better to get the letter early from them and send it at the intended time you're applying, or is it better to wait until the year you're applying and reach out to them? Yeah, so what I would do is split the difference. So say I'm in my 2nd year, I just had a great class, or maybe 2nd year is a little too early, but like I'm not applying yet. I had a great class with the professor and I want them to write me a letter. I would maybe ask for that letter or let them know that I would like a letter in the future. Then they can decide what they want to do. Maybe they make some notes, maybe they actually do like a bullet point draft. And then you come back to them when you're ready to apply, and then they kind of have whatever they're working with. I probably wouldn't send a letter dated 2 years ago, right? So when someone writes the reference letter, they're typically going to include the date on it. And if they actually wrote it, saved it as a PDF, and then you were now trying to send it off, I think if someone opens it up and sees a PDF with a date from 2020 on it or 2019, that's going to look maybe not great. So let them know that you are going to want the letter. They may do a draft or put some material together, but you probably want it to be dated fairly close to the time when you apply. Yeah, can I ask my potential supervisor for reference letter? Is there a faculty member I worked with during my undergrad? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that's a problem. If for some reason it is, they will tell you that they can't do it or that's not appropriate. But I think that seems very reasonable if there's someone you've worked with. And then if I ask profs to write reference letters for me a few years after I graduated, how do I reach out to them and remind them of me? I would offer to send them anything you can. So do you have any materials from that course? Do you have a record of the grade you got in that course? Do you have old assignments as well as your current materials, right? In some ways, what they actually most need are the materials for your grad school application. So if they're willing to work with your CV and your statement, that's probably what's most helpful. The way I think to kind of get out in front of this is say, you're graduating this year, but you aren't going to apply to grad school for a couple years. Let the profs know now, I'm planning to apply to my master's in 2024. I'm wondering if you need anything from me now or what would be most helpful, just so that kind of jogs their memory. But if it has been a couple years, I think reach out. Hopefully you're choosing someone where you did well in their course or you interacted with them, which kind of increases the odds that they will know about you. I am going to do 2 things. I'm going to launch a poll just as we are getting a little bit close to the end. Lots of time for Q&A, but if you want to kind of work on this in the background, feel free. And then I'm just going to touch on some ways to approach talking with grad schools next week, and then we'll use the rest of our time for open Q&A. So you should be able to have access to that poll. If you can let us know, that's helpful. In the meantime, some things you might want to do next week at the fair, if there are schools there, or programs. I would take a look at the program descriptions, right? I think I saw U of T is going to be there. I think their pharmacology department, if I'm remembering well. I would want to take a look and see what programs does that department offer, so that when I walk up to their booth, I can say, you know, I'm interested in this program. That's just good research to do ahead of time, so that you can ask questions more efficiently. And sorry, you're not actually walking up to their booth because it's online, but the virtual equivalent of it. If you know that there are specific programs, I saw that there were a number of law schools, for example, who are going to be there next week. Look at their application process, right? I know as we've moved through this session, I've mentioned another number of times to ask a program. If you can, before next week, actually identify, here are the questions I'd love to ask someone, the virtual fair is a great opportunity to have someone there to ask those questions. So if you know that you are going to be applying and they have that information up, look it over and then come kind of prepared with those questions so that you can hopefully get some of that information on the spot. If you don't have specific questions because their information is clear, which is wonderful, I would consider asking about the program structure. So as we've talked about, you know, some of these questions that came up in the chat, is your co-op national or international? Some of these things would be great. Learning experience, what do they focus on? What are their goals? What do they hear from current students, right? What do they find current students really like about the program? That's a good way to get those insights. I know there were a bunch of questions about funding and financial supports. Great thing to ask next week for the schools and the institutions that are there. The location of the city also came up. So if they are there from Calgary, London, Sydney, wherever they're from, ask them, what is it like living there? What's the cost of living? Is it outdoorsy? How cold does it get? Whatever the questions that might help you to make that decision. And then the career prospects and outcomes, right? Do they have any information, any statistics or updates about what students from that program go on to do, what the employment rate or outcome rate is? If you have a particular career outcome that you are hoping for from that program, is that something that current students are doing or that alumni have gone on to do? That's a really reasonable question to ask. And all of this can help you to understand whether this is the right school for you. All right, we have a few minutes left. I know folks may have to go, which is okay. I have about 10 more minutes I can take for questions. So I'm just going to continue on with Q&A. If you do need to head out, feel free to do so. I wish you the best of luck at the fair next week and also with your grad school applications. If there are ways that the Career Center at your institution can support you, please get in touch with them. I know that's a big part of what we do. And in the meantime, I will take some additional questions from the chat. Okay, if your intended program is not on the list for grad schools on the West Coast Virtual Fair, is there any point in attending? That's a really good question. I would say, I mean, maybe. Well, I mean, I guess two things. There are going to be employers and volunteer opportunities there. So if that's of interest to you, you could absolutely go to the fair and engage with them instead of the grad schools. If none of the schools are anything similar to what you're planning to apply to, then probably not. I think, you know, the chiropractic college probably can't give you a ton of insight into the Masters of Journalism that you're hoping to apply to. If you think that there's some crossover, you could, and you could just kind of use that as a guide of kind of like maybe similar to my program. Now, I wouldn't do that for logistics, like when is the deadline, but like structure, what they like to see in a statement of intent might be somewhat useful. I will also say that programs often do their own info sessions. So worth checking out, does the program you want to apply to actually do their own personal info session or something somewhere? Does the time you apply impact decisions for acceptance at all? Some programs do what's called rolling applications, which means they review applications as they come in. If that's the case, there probably is some advantage to getting a earlier application in. If it is just like the deadline is December 15th, that probably means that as long as you get it in by that deadline, you will be considered. So just pay attention to how they're describing the deadline. If it's rolling, then they're reviewing them as they come in. If it is sort of a, here's our cutoff, you want to make sure you get it in before that cutoff, but typically not. Then that means you'd be reviewed with the rest of the pile. Okay, I'll come back to CV formats in a second. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, I don't see any counseling programs on the list. Yeah, okay. If the programs that are represented at the fair are not related to counseling, then that just may not be the best platform for them. Now, what I might get curious about at the fair next week is, are there organizations where counselors eventually work? Would they have insights into what they look for when they hire, things they want to see? That might be a kind of longer view way to approach it. So Zoom apparently was a bit glitchy when I was talking about CV formats, but basically there isn't like a standard CV template that you can just pop it into, and that's because it's different from academic discipline to academic discipline. What I would look at for your guide for a CV format would be the CV of researchers in your field, so profs or grad students or researchers, and maybe also look at the website for your institution. Their career site likely might have some samples, general samples of CVs that you could look at there. If I finish my degree spring 2023, would I still be able to apply to start a grad program September 2023? Yeah, so what I need to take year off, kind of just asking if early acceptance exists. Yeah, so I think if I'm understanding correctly, it's very normal to apply with your degree in progress, and having your degree completed is not a prerequisite for applying. It is a prerequisite for starting the program. So as an example, if I had a program where the deadline was December 1st to start September 2023, and I'm going to graduate in June, I can absolutely go ahead and apply for that December 1st deadline. My program doesn't have to be finished. I just show them what I've done so far. They would let me know in probably March or April. Still haven't finished my program, but as long as I do, then in June when I finish, you confirm with them, yes, I did complete the degree. But if I'm understanding correctly, yes, it's not a barrier to apply. You do have to have that program finished before you could start in September with your new grad program. So if you were delayed, that might cause problems. But it's really normal to apply, even if you're still working on a degree, as long as the expectation is you're on track to finish it by the time your master's starts. Okay, good. And question about reach out to you if we think of more questions. Yes, I'm not sure if you are a UBC student. That is the office I work out of. If you are, yes, please come and see us. We're at the Center for Student Involvement and Careers. You can look us up there. If you're at UVIC or SFU, check out the Career Center for your institution, and any of your advisors there will be happy to help you out. I think that is pretty good time, folks. I'm just going to stop the recording in case there's any final questions here.